Jeremy, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're doing well in Louisiana. Let's let's talk about a couple of things. But first, I wanted to ask you a question about the
Sure.
upcoming talk that you're giving at Creole de Monde um,
The exhibit. Yeah, it's at the
exhibit.
West
Yeah.
Baton Rouge Museum, which is in Port Allen, which is a short distance away from Baton Rouge. It's a wonderful exhibit. I haven't seen it yet. It doesn't open for a few more days. But it's an interesting exhibit because it doesn't just talk about Louisiana Creoles, but it talks about Creoles of the world, hence the name. But I think what's wonderful about it is that we are finally. I think while it focuses on all the Creoles, I think we're going to have a pretty good placement of Creoles from Louisiana, depictions, and some history. So it's a great way for people to learn about maybe their culture or maybe about the culture that they probably are still trying to demystify
Yeah,
Creole.
and I heard I see that Jean Lafleur is on there as well, doing his thing with cuisine there as well. So that sounds like it's going to be a pretty good lineup, and it goes on for about a month or some or so, right?
Couple months, yeah, a
Yeah,
couple months, and we can put up a link for that for more information on that.
yeah. You should. We definitely should. Okay,
I'm
so
learning about a dozen pieces, so they have quite a bit of stuff, and they're getting in a really significant portrait of a free woman of color from the Lafayette Museum by Adolph Rink, which is really just one of the finest portraits, and that's going to be great to see that there.
okay, and you're sharing a bunch of your pieces as well.
Yeah, I am. I'm
Okay.
sharing about a dozen pieces or so, including a portrait of a white Creole that hasn't been on display since 1903. So that's kind of
Oh,
yeah.
that's awesome.
It's
That's
pretty
awesome. Okay, we'll make sure we get that on there. So there was a number of topics we wanted to talk about.
right.
So why don't we jump off into them with the first topic
Sure.
that you have there.
Origins of Creoles. Where did these people come from? And we're specifically we'll talk about the Creoles of color, the Louisiana Creoles of color. So where did they come from? Everyone seems to have this notion that they are all the manumitted slaves of plantation owners and enslaved women. And when we look back, we see back at archival evidence, we see that that's not actually the case. Yes, there were of course liberated children, and that's sure a lot of them. But there was also other ways that people could become free people of color, and one of those ways was military servitude. Uh,
Hmm.
of course, another way was through coartación, which was introduced under the Spanish colonial period, where a enslaved person could go get appraised, and then they could work and pay to for their freedom. So, these are important because I think there's this kind of lends to a lot of myths that a lot of these people were just the, illegitimate children of this or that. But we
Hmm.
see a bunch of different ways that free people of color, and of course, some of the largest, the largest number of free people of color came also from Saint Domingue as refugees. So we also see these free people of color who came to the United States, or not United States, but Louisiana, that were already free, and came here and greatly, influenced the
Yeah,
population.
I mean, basically, even before that, I mean, we're talking about free people of color and free black people being there from Spanish times. So, not only do we have the Maroons, not necessarily in New Orleans per se, but up and down the Atlantic coast, but we have groups of African Americans or Africans there from Spanish times, and my relatives settled in Alabama in 1724, and they lived next to Chastain's Bluff, which was known to have free people of color who had been there from Spanish times. Certainly, my relatives came um, during the time that of the Haitian Revolution. They were refugees for a number of years in Cuba and in Jamaica,
Right.
hoping that the French would go back and reinvade and reinstall slavery and they could get their lives back. That didn't happen.
No.
Um, and so they came to New Orleans, but many of them left with their slaves, and basically when in 1809, when many of the refugees were kicked off of Cuba due to Napoleon coming in and um, basically invading Spain and making all. I mean, so when Napoleon invaded Spain, the Spanish in Cuba got extremely angry and kicked off all the French that were there, kind of waiting, hopefully that the French would reinvade Saint Domingue and they could go back to Saint Domingue. So basically, that doubled the population of New Orleans. So yeah, I mean they came from all over. I mean even before that, we talk about free people of color coming here and free Africans coming here. So there's a varied history of free people of color, and we're talking specifically about our folks from Louisiana, and but obviously there were no all a variety of people who came as
Right.
free people. So we need to squelch that idea that only free people of color were just from white landowners and their
and,
slaves.
and house slaves specifically. This
Yeah.
working in the house, and we see there are many ways that people became free, and one of the more interesting ways is self-purchase. I think that's amazing, and there's several instances of entrepreneurs becoming free. I mean, Rose DeCaw is one of the famous ones.
Mm.
That had a coffee stand in Socala, which is a little rice deep fried rice beignet almost,
Mhm.
and she was able to earn her freedom through that way. And there are other instances of that. Carpenters, furniture makers, all these people were some of them were able to purchase their own freedom through their skill.
Yeah, my seventh great grandmother's purchased her own freedom from her former master and or husband in 1763. Obviously that 1763 date is an important date because that's the year that the Spanish came and took over Louisiana and basically made Cortacion part of the whole scheme of things as far as manumissions are concerned.
Right.
Um,
It's
and
there
Go
was
ahead.
emancipation as well for people who are not necessarily the children of their masters. Either we see there's an instance of your great grandmother reminded me of a story of one of my ancestors who was an alchemist and apparently was, according to legend, was able to save and treat some of her masters back to health, nursed them back to health, and she was granted her freedom. So there's more than one way that these people came free.
And speaking of that, a slave of Mariko Want, who founded the school there for orphaned black children, also gave freedom to the woman who nursed her in her later years. So, you know, um, there's a long history of that,
Right.
and we need to recognize that, and that's how people, and again, once people were able to buy themselves out of freedom, then they bought their relatives and other people out of freedom.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, yeah, so we need to see that there's a whole cycle of things that happened other than this one sort of
And we can talk
static.
more about that on talking point three, because I
Okay,
think we can kind of talk about how they were able to kind of get some of their family members out of slavery as well.
okay.
But
Yeah, so I mean, the refugee, my families were refugees for 20 years, and that the whole story that we have, the sort of convoluted story that we have with Haiti now, and this kind of dovetails into the recent uh, hubbub that our president has had about Haiti. But this Haiti was basically paupered by the French after they were defeated and kicked off the island. The French and Thomas Jefferson from the United States basically had a naval blockade and embargoed the island and forced this sort of newly formed Black Republic to pay reparations and the reparations were at such a high rate of interest from the Bank of France that it basically paupered Haiti for generations, and
Right.
really was one of the causes of their really the poverty that we've had there, and the unrest as well. I mean, so
Yeah,
um,
turbulent history. I mean, even today, we still see the ripples of that, which is completely reasonable. We still see the ripples of slavery in the United States. Of course, you're going to see that in Haiti, but also the financial crippling of them by these entities who took advantage of them,
mhm.
continue to take advantage of them. And this is not just exclusive, of course, to Haiti. You see this in other nations in Africa and everywhere else. You
Yeah,
know.
and my relatives, took the reparation money that they got from Haiti and bought houses and lots in New Orleans and helped develop New Orleans. So, you know,
And a lot of other people did that. And we were talking about Creoles Demont exhibit. I have a piece there, a portrait of a lady who was from the Le Mercier Duquesne family, and they were right there. They were in Saint Domingue. Then they went to, of course, Cuba. Then they went to Jamaica, and then after the revolution in Jamaica, they tried to get to New Orleans. It was this kind of this desperate attempt for, I guess, what had become normal life for them. But by the time they arrived in New Orleans, within 3 or 4 years, it was over as
yeah,
well. So
yeah. I think once they went to Cuba, Jamaica, uh, you know, uh,
you think they would have learned something else?
yeah, they figured it out. They realized that the time was that it wasn't coming back.
Maybe we should learn a trade and stop trying to,
Yeah, stop trying
uh,
to go back and be slave owners in the Saint Domingue. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's a long and sort of convoluted story. But let's talk about the second topic that
okay.
you wanted to. And
So let's talk about the Creole women, which seem to be the topic of much sensationalized reports, plusage, quadroon balls, and all of this. As we did a whole video on in that, and I think you could probably do three or four more because it's something that's constantly brought up. It's always talked about, and what we've really, I think, the consensus of the last video is that there is no evidence that supports that this occurred, and
mhm.
it's something that was just it was something that was told and then retold and then told again, and sensationalized, and it's simply not true. It's
Yeah,
fiction.
and I mean, your point that you made is that just saying it over and over again does not make it true.
No,
And we obviously we know better than this. I mean, my relatives were free women of color, and I have generations and generations of family that were there. Now they had all kinds of different relationships, and there were free women of color who had relationships with white men.
of course.
There were free women of colors, but in general, free women of color married other free men of color. Free men of color were they were available. They were very prosperous. Yeah, and they were part of the engine that drove the city. They were in every worked in every aspect of Creole New Orleans, and and really, one of the things that kind of gets me about this is as well is that in Creole, in the South in general, slaves did every form of labor that you can talk about. It wasn't just labor in manual labor in fields. So they were, lamplighters,
Mhm.
tinners, draymen. They worked as caulkers. They were across the board in skilled and unskilled labor.
Yeah,
So I mean, there was and New Orleans was a prosperous town. It was a it was prosperous obviously because of the port and so much traffic of coming through the port itself. So there was a lot of prosperity and a lot of opportunities that were available to slaves and free men of color that was not available in other cities. So we have to think about that in the context of free women of color and the availability that they had of getting spouses. I mean,
Right. Well, and the fact we talked about this last time too. The biggest important part, if else in this video, and you came here just to hear about the Plisage and quadruballs, you need to ask yourself something. Where were the free men of color? They're never mentioned. I mean, the idea is that these people of color, these mixed race people, these quadroons, apparently they only had daughters. They never. I mean, where were the men of color? What do you think happened to these men? They didn't cease to exist. They were there, and that's important. The fact that history has somehow omitted these people, that should be that's suspicious, and there's a reason behind that.
Well, I can show you. I can show you the names of all the free men of color who fought in the two battalions in 1812, and then I can show you the names of the more than 1,000 men who signed the petition um, um, for voting rights from New Orleans. So there were a number of there were a lot of free men of color, and
Someone brought up this recently, and I think it's important to talk about. They look at the French Quarter survey where it shows the property owners, and a lot of times it shows a woman's name, a femme de couleur libre, a free woman of
mhm,
color.
mhm,
This is not uncommon. The Creoles were smart, very smart. They were litigious, and a lot of them realized that if you put the house, which a lot of times is, even in today's times, is the largest asset that a person has, in your wife's name, then it's a separate property. So you
mhm,
creditors come in after you, say you default on a loan, which was common because we're in a cashless society. You're
mhm,
constantly borrowing money. They can come after you, but you're not going to lose your house.
mhm,
And we see this over and over. We even see this in Point Capee. The day after the Civil War, we see free women of color file for divorce from their husbands. That was so they
mhm,
could separate their properties so creditors could not come in because they were not going to make good on any outstanding loans the day,
mhm.
the Civil War. So, a lot of people say, well, what about that? I mean, that certainly, no, that doesn't show anything. It shows that they knew how to work the system. I mean, they had an 80% literacy rate. That
Yeah,
was higher than the literacy rates of whites.
yeah.
These people were not fools. They were not foolish. They knew what
And,
they
and
knew.
and you know something? I have a TO relative who had a falling out with her husband, moved out, and when he defaulted on payments on his property, she bought it at auction, bought his house from underneath him. So I mean, they knew what they were doing as far as operating the system, and one of the things that is to me in my mind is makes us sort of a community is that Creoles were very used to using that legal system to help themselves in a lot of different ways, and but more than just protecting assets,
Correct.
but protecting children who had parents that died, and making sure that they were taken care of. So they were very shrewd about using the legal system that they had there, and of course during pre 1803 they could testify and get rulings against white people. So there was no issues about that, and that was one of the rights that they used in a lot of different ways because they used to rent property to white renters, and when they would default, they would take them to court and they would win judgments against them. So that was one of the things that you know um, gets kind of lost in the whole thing that in Creole New Orleans, one of the things that made it kind of a special place is that the legal system was not completely rigged for
Right.
against them. That came later. You know.
Later, and like you were saying, later they kept passing pieces of legislation that would limit their rights. But the Creoles were always completely aware of their rights, and it's not so much they just knew. No, it's because they had to know. They had to know
Hmm.
how they were able
Hmm.
to survive. And we even see this in instances. And when we talk about Creole women or women of color with relationships with white men, we know that, of course, that did happen as well. And there were even instances where white men, after further legislation was placed limiting the ability for their children of color to inherit, we see instances of white men, signing over property to other white spouses spouses or partners for their children, so they could successfully pass that on. So everybody was working the system, and if you visit New Orleans, I think you can say that some people are still working the system.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a thing.
And you know something, as legislation got more and more restrictive, a couple of my relatives who were white men who were married to women of color just declared themselves of color at the end
Yeah.
of their lives, and they were able to transfer their property to their children without any issues.
Yeah.
And my Boyard relative declared himself of color so that he could marry a free woman of color in the 1850s. So I mean. One of the things that we get into is this. When you look at those pictures that you have, the portraits that you have, these are
Hmm.
beautiful women.
Yes.
So why would it be strange that white men would be attracted to them? They're beautiful. They're smart. They're movers and shakers. They have a personal initiative. What would be wrong for somebody to be attracted to them? I don't, so
And in many instances, they fared better in this colony. So you see a lot of widowed white men because European women did not do well. I mean, Creoles did better even with yellow fever and some of these other things because they caught this show before. You understand? So
hmm
women
hmm
did not survive well. So in many instances, you see cases where a white man after he was widowed did form a lifelong companionship with a free woman of color, and you see, mortality was it was tricky back then. Death was always at your door, so you often see people being married more than one time. Or having more than one relationship. This is quite common in
hmm
New
yeah.
Orleans.
And I had many relatives who died young for dysentery and things
Yeah.
that we would not associate, with that length of time, being alive. So, I think, like I say, in my book, I certainly try to point out that, many white men chose free women of color out of preference. Um, and
Not only because of some assertions by some historians who say that there were not enough European women. That's really not the case, especially in the time period that we're talking about in the 1830s and 40s. I think they just preferred these women.
yeah,
That
yeah, I mean, yeah, and,
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 and
and and there's nothing wrong with saying that. There's
No,
nothing wrong
but
with
there was
saying that.
something wrong with saying it in the past, but now we can say it, and this gets into the Tignons and all of that. Many European women were threatened by the beauty of these women, and and we see that with this Tignon laws, which we're not quite sure how heavily they were enforced, but we do know women of color and white women also wore these elaborate head wraps,
hmm
and it was part of the culture there, wearing these wraps, which later were called tignons or moisseaux.
hmm Yeah, and this the the progression that people had there. You know, I take the story of Mariko Want, who has a similar story to some of my relatives. But here she is. She's kicked off of Saint Domingue. She's a refugee. She comes to New Orleans. She by the time she gets to New Orleans, she's a free woman of color. Doesn't know how to read or write. Um, Earns enough money to buy her husband's freedom. And he's a slave of the Ursuline nuns, which is strange enough, and a very talented carpenter, and together they create a small empire of by buying, selling, and building homes. And in at the end of her life, she's able to donate the land for Marie Couant School, which goes on in perpetuity and is still around today um, as a middle school. So you start thinking about that. She donated that school in 1837, and we're talking about an ongoing concern that is a middle school right now in 2017. So you think of the power that woman had.
Creoles were
Um,
philanthropic. I mean, they contributed. They weren't just they were patrons of the arts. I mean, they were. I mean, everything you see in New Orleans, there's some specifically the Creoles of African descent. I mean, whether it's the drum you hear in the distance, whether it's the exotic colors, the architecture, the smells of the food, all of this goes right back to these Creoles of color. And it's for so long you haven't been able to say that because you didn't have a platform to talk about this, and all that came out were books by people on the outside looking in. But now we're finally able to through digitization of records and everything else, we're able to read our own stories. In the past, you couldn't just get these records. I mean, there are instances where people would walk in and try to get these records, and they just tell you no, and you'd have to leave. I mean, that's it. You had no power, and you had no platform to contest accounts, of these false accounts of plissage and quadroon balls.
mhm.
You know,
The other thing is, like I said, we talked about this sort of the morality of of Louisiana and the French and Latin in general. They didn't think anything of not being married in church, and my many of my relatives are perfect example is a relative of mine who was in Saint Domingue. She had a relationship with a planter there in Saint Domingue, had a daughter, and in unfortunately, the father died, but he left a guardian, another white French guardian as her guardian, and he really kept her intact for 20 years until she was married off. You start thinking about the relationships that people had there, and of course that was in Saint Domingue. That was before her children came to New Orleans. So there was a certain continuity that was involved, and we need to understand how that continuity. I mean, it comes through to today. I mean, because obviously we're talking about it, and we're talking about it in a way that probably it has not been talked about. You know what I'm saying? And we need to continue to have these kind of conversations
we're
because
finding new things every day, and the great thing about something like what we're doing right now on the Skype interview is we know this stuff because we've read it, but it comes up in conversation, and that's it's the pieces fall together. And I think for people who are trying to learn about this,
hmm
just to watch this and listen to this, and you can look, you need to get on Google. Don't take our word for it. Start digging around, start reading,
hmm
and I'm very confident you're going to agree with us. You're
yeah.
going to find this. So that's the great thing about the internet. Of course, there's a lot of bad information too. So make sure that you have some primary sources, and check for good sources. Don't just go on Wikipedia or
hmm
something like that. You know,
Yeah.
or if you go on Wikipedia, check at the bottom, find where the sources were, and read those original sources. Find where they got it from. You got to do a little due diligence, but you're going to find the truth. It's there.
hmm
You have
Yeah.
access to that now.
Yeah. So, I know we wanted to talk about, Creoles and sort of at every class. And,
Mhm.
we had Creoles that were slaves all the way up to very rich landowners and super wealthy people. And, you know, uh, boy, w- we talk about this and like I say, we had a webcast about this. But I don't ever feel like this issue is resolved
No,
about
never
what is
exalted.
a Creole, what is the criteria for Creole, and
Right.
what kind of class of people were they? Because you, I mean, we may say something that we think is honest and well researched, and then we get on the internet and we see something that it just is, it doesn't make any sense. So we have to keep reinforcing. It's sad that we have to keep reinforcing this, but it's a, it is a really, it's a real problem because it's so misunderstood and there's so much misinformation. And I know you wanted to talk about some of this
Right.
Anglo kind of,
Well,
um,
and some of it, it's interesting. We do mention a lot of Anglo inventions. We're responsible for plissage and quadroon balls and all that. But some of this was actually misdirection by white Creoles. I mean, during a lot of this was during Reconstruction. It was very scary for even a white Creole during Reconstruction because there were countless cases of people claiming that white people had African blood. So they were very, very scared. Where in the past they would have waved to their cousin at the French market, maybe, or done a little, gesture, something like that. That didn't happen after the Civil War. That didn't happen during Reconstruction. White people withdrew completely. I hear often a lot of people say, "Oh, the white Creoles wanted nothing to do with the Creoles of color." That's not quite true. We see otherwise. These people were constantly engaged in business ventures. They were engaged in relationships. They were giving their children of color inheritance. So we know that that's not the case. But there was a point, and Reconstruction all the way up to the 1960s, 70s, 80s.
Yep.
80s stuff started turning around a little bit, and now with this DNA and ancestry, people just gonna have to get over it. They're gonna learn they have some cousins of color, and they might figure out they are the cousins of color, and that's okay. That's okay.
Well, you're laughing, but
It's
in
true.
going through my book, boy, I tell you, some people got some rude awakenings.
Yeah.
And the one thing that you mentioned about Reconstruction,
Right.
I think that this is a strange thing. We have white Creoles and black Creoles, we have Creoles that passed, and what you were talking about is that using black heritage to shame, discourage, and intimidate people is something that there's case after case of it in this legal history of the color line, which is by Frank Sweet, and he goes through all the legal cases that come up, and that one drop. Well, of course, when got into the one drop rule, and we had people of color, that was used
Right.
many times to intimidate white people and to stop them from exercising their rights or allowing black people to exercise their rights. And so it was a powerful tool, as well as an economic tool. Certainly, if you had black blood, you were not able to get loans from white banks.
You
So
couldn't put your daughters into white society. If
exactly.
if your name was besmirched, you might as well pick up and move away. Your daughters will not be married, and if they are married right now, you're subject to legal action because you lied, and you
Hmm.
lied, and you call it's fraudulent. So these Creoles, these white Creoles, were scared out of their mind, and a lot of them should have been because a lot of them had half siblings, cousins, children who were of color. The fact of the matter is, it was paranoia. We're seeing something similar in this country right now. All of this kind of is, I mean, in not necessarily racially, but in other ways, we see people becoming very paranoid, xenophobic, and all of this. These are all bad things. These lead
Hmm.
to bad places. And if you look at history, you pick up a book, you realize it's not. You can't be like that. You got to fight that urge, and you got to try to see clearly because division is it's no good and it leads to bad places, and that's what was happening. I brought up I've talked to you about this before. We're talking about a lot of these ideas that Creole meant white only. We hear this all day long. We hear a lot of people of color say this, and
Hmm.
they are repeating. They don't realize they're repeating this. They are repeating the words of Charles Gayar, and some other historians. He was a white Creole, a wealthy white Creole. He was involved in politics, and he wrote a three-volume novel in Louisiana. He was extremely racist. Said he actually ran George Washington Cable out of town. He and a group of other people was because George Washington Cable was talking about we're talking about the in his stories the connections that these white Creoles had with these Creoles of color, and they
Hmm.
were very nervous about that. George Washington Cable literally was run out of town. I found that interesting, and I'm not sure if that's literal, but they put a lot of pressure on him, and he did end up moving from New Orleans. Now, what's ironic about all this, Charles Gayar claims to never have had any children, yet there was another Charles Gayar living in the city of New Orleans that everybody knew was his child. And guess what? He was a free man of color. And but now, from what I understand, he passed as white. It's a tricky thing, and that's the crazy thing about these white Creoles in New Orleans, is them for a lot of these white Creoles, a lot of their children of color just slipped under the color line, and no one challenged them. But there was always that fear that somebody could challenge them. We said this before. You made someone, the wrong person, mad, and they could make a problem for you. They could talk about your family being of color, and so we see these Creoles of color during this time period become very uncomfortable and try to distance themselves from the Creoles of color, and maybe now, just now, they're starting to come out and be okay with it.
Yeah, and Charles Gayar, he was a sort of a renowned professor at Tulane, a professor of Romance languages. He wrote a book on folklore. That's a very good book about Louisiana folklore. But yeah, he was a revisionist. He wanted to separate white. He wanted to make white Creoles and black Creoles, which is not what Creoles are about.
Right.
Now, so we understand it now in the context of it was Reconstruction, and you know, we have to look at it in the context of this as well. Those lighter folks um, among us who were Creoles um, moved away oftentimes to take advantage of opportunities that were available to them, and they had to put some distance between their of color or darker Creole relatives, and that happened as well. And that was part of this whole problem that we had surrounding the Reconstruction all the way through to the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, it wasn't just some simple 10-year period.
Right.
It was long. It was generations, and so we have to do some healing between generations of people here, who many of whom have been brought up thinking that they had no mixed ancestry, and are
Right.
now finding out through DNA that they do.
Right.
Certainly when I wrote my book and I was contacting people, I learned a valuable lesson. I was very careful about how I approach people
Oh yeah.
when I talk to them on the phone, especially when I thought people did not know that their ancestry.
Some.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and wow, I can't tell you how many times I had the phone slammed in my ears when I mentioned somebody being of color, um, and they couldn't understand the concept of white Creoles, right? And so somebody who is a scholar got mad at me because of the criterion I was using for Creole, and I said, well, pre 1803, being able to connect your family to pre 1803 to me is critical for your identifying as a Creole, because that's sort of the
That's
not, I wouldn't say the zenith, but
Purchase.
what
So for people who don't know what 1803 was, that's pre-Louisiana Purchase.
pre
So you had
Louisiana Purchase, correct?
colonial roots in Louisiana, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and really, it took a generation, maybe 20 to 30 years, for the Americans to really just ratchet down all the pressure. But pre 1803, you had a Creole society that was, you know, it was not paramount what color you were. Birthright was determined and by the class of people that you were born to.
Class
Um,
more important than race, but we have to be careful because we don't want anyone to have the idea that this was a perfect society. Obviously, the institution of slavery was still there, so there was still obviously it was still racist society, of course.
yeah, yeah, it was no, it was a racist society, and we're not I
Right,
can't
right,
doubt
right.
that at
But
all,
these
right?
lines are blurred, and there were moments, for some reason, of fluid relationships. You know,
Well, here's what I'll say. That because they had coartación and manumission available to them, people could move out of slavery, and
right,
so there was a vehicle to move out of slavery, and so it gave a different flavor to society because now you couldn't just look at a black person or a person of color and say they were a slave. You had to investigate a little bit more to find out whether they were free or slave. And because of the city of New Orleans, slaves, and I mean, the city of New Orleans, look, you know, in 1810, it was two-thirds black or two-thirds people of color and one-third white. So in pre-1803 New Orleans, people had to consider who a little bit more. They had to use a little bit better judgment and think about how they handled their relationship with people. And so you know
They
that
needed participation with these people. They lived with these people. They were right next to them. We have a lot of reports, and I'm agree with you. I'm just saying, we have a lot of reports of people beating their slaves and everything like that. And of course, these sort of things happened. We know that there were people who were no good, like there are people today that are no good, who mistreated their slaves and everything else. And so I don't want to say that did not happen. Absolutely happened, and there are great atrocities that happen to people of color, especially women of color. But as a whole, these people had to be careful because if they acted too crazy, they knew that revolution could happen. And I'm not saying that they were nice and walking on eggshells, but there was a balance that they knew they had to maintain in order to keep peace because
Mhm.
they were always fearful, with the majority colored society that,
Oh, I mean,
you know,
the perfect example is Claiborne being afraid to dissolve the Creole militia
right.
in 1803 when he got there. He said, hey, I don't want to make enemy of these people. We've got an armed uh, uh, of color society here. We got to be careful about how we do this. I need some instructions about because he didn't understand what was going on. He didn't understand that military service is part of the whole Creole identity, and so it took him a long time and a lot of urging by the new Americans to come in because they were scared crapless of this. That for him to actually do this, and then of course in 1812 he had to reconstitute them and put in some sort of uh, waivers to make sure that only the best Creoles got to enlist in the Freemen Battalion. But yeah, I mean, and so like I said, getting back to that pre-1803 criterion, you know, um, people had a mindset when their families were there in pre-1803 that
Mhm.
later families did not have. And um, the fluidity and the mobility in society was greater. Now, it was a society with slaves, but it was not a slave society. And after the Americans came, they turned it into a slave society. They made New Orleans the largest slave market in the country. They ratcheted up pressure on free people of color and slaves. They enforced, um, you know, uh, getting rid of manumission. In 1830, they tried to rid Louisiana of the French language, for Christ's sakes. They were on a step by step um, um, method of trying to dismantle the society that had been created there. And why would you do that? Because you're fearful of it. You don't know about it. It's
And they
something new.
approach this whole subject or this whole infrastructure differently. We are always careful to say you have to remember that the Spanish and French they were some dogs too. They were
Yes,
participating
sir.
in
Mhm.
this slavery. Okay, I mean, as much as I think the French culture is interesting and this and that, you have to recognize fault where fault is. But one thing that is important and interesting to recognize, and more so with the Spanish, is that they did not see slavery as a permanent condition. These Americans thought once you're a slave, once you're a person of African descent, you are always inferior. We talked about the casta paintings, as ridiculous as they are, but they did believe there was a hierarchy, that people could transition here and there. And we talked about this last time, maybe that came from some of their own past where they were conquered by the Moors and everything else. But in short, they were the better of the evils. and so,
Mhm.
so, and that kind of brings us to our next point where a lot of people think because of what we talked about, that Creoles are only the white rich slave owners, and they all Creoles of color owned slaves. Most did not own slaves. And the ones that did own slaves, very few owned more than a few or a handful of slaves. You may say, well, it doesn't matter. One slave is too much. I agree. But we were talking about earlier that when people became free, what did they try to do? Liberate their family members.
Mhm.
So, cashless society, you had to purchase a slave. You had to take a loan out. You had to borrow money.
Mhm.
So a lot of these people are enslaved until you can afford to free them. You didn't have the money to simply say, okay, cousin, you're free. So you have three or four people who are sometimes blood related, being owned by another family member and living and working in that, and especially in the urban environments, New Orleans, working in that house and
Mhm.
listed as enslaved. So I'm not trying to say that all free people of color, only bought family members. Some of them were just straight up
Straight up dogs. Yep.
years, straight
Mhm.
up dogs, owned 100 slaves, and they were after one thing,
Mhm.
money. And that's,
Mhm.
and we still got that today. People sell out each other for money. So this is
Yeah.
nothing new or interesting. And we cannot allow these people to continue to bring up that Creoles of color owned slave. I went to a plantation tour less than a year ago, and the first thing the guy said was, some blacks own slaves. So what? So what? Some Jewish people own slaves. Some Native
Yeah.
Americans own slaves. There was dogs everywhere. There's some no good people everywhere.
There's
Does
no good people everywhere. That's exactly. And I have a story of one of my relatives, Filipas Story, who was a charcoal merchant in New Orleans, and he had a son by his slave, and he kept that son in servitude until his death. Um, and then his son, after all that, after living 37 years in
Mhm.
servitude as a slave to his father had two other slaves that worked in this charcoal business with him. He kept those two slaves as slaves. And, and so, do I try to candy coat that? No, I'm trying to candy coat that. I mean, they they were terrible people. I mean, and I probably should use some tougher language than that, but I'm not gonna. But but that's a story. That's a story that of now. Here's my relative. I'm not trying to candy coat it.
Right.
He's a dirty dog. And the reason that slavery lasted for so long here in the United States is because of people like that propped up the institution. Um, and we like I say we have a very interesting situation in New Orleans because there was this fluidity out of slavery and into society, and then you basically had no stigma attached to you. I mean, once you became a free person of color in New Orleans or Louisiana, you didn't have any the stigma of slavery didn't stick with you through your whole life. You went into the sort of pool of citizens, and you became a person that deserved the respect that you earned in society. So
Right. It was
that
part of
was
the balance, and that's not to say that these people were treated, of course, because we're speaking on this because we know, for other people listening, this is not to say that they were treated like outstanding white citizens and they were not still in a precarious situation. They were, but the difference is on a Wednesday afternoon when everyone's leaving church, you might say hi to that person and they might not think of you for a minute as this or that. There was still a balance of, oh, well, our kids know them, or there was life happened with these
hmm
people.
hmm
And they were reminded of race, and it was constantly something that popped up. Believe me, it was never, perfect, of course, and never anything like that. But life happened, and they wanted to keep that balance, and they weren't trying to upset that balance. So they didn't, go after these people until later on with the influx of Americans and then the changing of ideology that slavery should be a permanent condition and that the people of African descent are inferior. These reinforced notions of white supremacy that
Right.
happen.
And there was a Facebook post today of a guy saying exactly that. and basically saying, he's talking about immigrants, obviously, saying, yeah, Trump's getting this right. He should send the immigrants back. And I absolutely, I bristle at this, because of the temerity that this guy has. Here he is, uh, you know, uh, and Jeremy, you're gonna have to just forgive me. I'm gonna go on a rant right now. But
Uh,
the temerity that he has, he's some, 1850 or 1890 Ellis Island person coming in saying, "Hey, this country that we built, we need to kick them out and everything like that." And I'm thinking to myself, wow, here I am. I'm a person of color. My family has been here since 1660. I've been here 200 years more than this guy. And I am not on TV saying we should kick any immigrants out. Can you imagine that? And I wanted to, I wish, I'd been in that room and be able to just confront him and say, hey, you Johnny come lately, you're not, you don't make the rules here. I mean, you had your day when you made the rules. And we saw how that all turned out. It was a gigantic mess. So, um, the I'm sorry, Jeremy,
so,
but but it's that idea, and he's still with that idea. He was still saying, yeah, blacks are inferior, and uh, you know, and and we talked about how free people of color came here, but one of the things that gets lost in all of this is that I mean, let's go way back to the Spanish conquistadors. The Spanish conquistadors came here with free men of color. Those
right.
guys, a lot of those conquistadors who helped the conquistadors conquer the Indians and do terrible things, enslave the Indians and kill them and take their land and take all their resources. They settled in Latin America. Um, we had Maroons that were marooned in on the Atlantic coast who
Mhm.
settled and intermarried with Indians. And so when we start thinking about free people of color, and those are free people of color, they're not under any white kind of domination. We need to start like integrating that in. Uh, Not only do we have we have this society in Louisiana, and Louisiana Territory went from Mobile, Alabama, all the way to the 49th parallel up in Canada, and we have of course we know that free people of color moved up and down that rail up and down the Mississippi in St. Louis and Detroit, and we know that they did that. So we have to.
In Maryland, the second largest population of free people of color was in Baltimore, Maryland. There was free people of color all over the country. Of course, Creoles were different because of the language, the French language, and that and all that. But there were many free people of color, many important contributions made by non-Louisiana free people of color.
Mhm. Yeah, and I know you're interested in the cabinet makers in North Carolina. What is it, Thomas Day or whatever?
Thomas Day, yeah, I saw a
Yeah.
piece recently. There's actually a attributed piece being sold in New Orleans in 2 days by Thomas Day. So if somebody's looking for one, go go on the internet. To talk about the slavery, I have these articles that we have to talk about because we were
Okay.
talking about the digitization of records. It's something we wouldn't have had access to. So, and I hope this isn't flipped. Can you read that? That's good.
I can't read it, but it's
Oh, I'm gonna read it. I'm just making sure you can see it. Okay, so
okay.
this is from the New Orleans Daily Crescent, 1854. Harboring a slave, Recorder Ramos yesterday issued a warrant for the arrest of a free woman of color named Anne, who resides on Old Basin, and who is charged with having harbored a slave. So let's go to the next one, which is another interesting. This is only from a couple of years, 1854 again. First District Court Judge Robertson, the grand jury yesterday found a true bill against August Cajus, a free man of color, for harboring and concealing a runaway slave. 1854 again. We have harboring a slave. Rachel Wright, the latter, a free colored woman, yesterday, criminal charges for renting a room and harboring a slave. Now, then we have this one, which is pretty interesting, from 1850, concealing a slave. The slave Andrew, belonging to Oscar Howell Baton Rouge, ran away. and was found in the house of a woman of color. Forged papers were also discovered. These people were hiding. They were forging papers for these slaves. They were attempting to get these people. So when we talk about aspects of the Underground Railroad, we can see that some free people of color were also part of that. And I think that's something that we might have not had access to 20 years ago. I can now just search free people of color enslaved and pull that out. But that's something that you might have had to spend, hours and hours and hours and hours, days and days, and might have only found two of those. And I was able to find that, in 20 minutes. So
Mhm.
we have these great advantages now where this true narrative is starting to emerge.
Yeah.
So I had to bring that up because we hear so much about free people of color and slaves. You don't ever hear what I just shared with you.
Yeah, and you know something? The other thing, let's bring up Tommy LaFont. That's a perfect example. Tommy LaFont, and his house is still there in the Ninth Ward. He was a philanthropist and supported the Underground Railroad in New Orleans. We're finding that out. On top of all the philanthropy that he did and all the places that he left money to and supported, we're finding out he risked a lot by being involved in helping people with the Underground Railroad. So, you know, um, you know, we talk about that. The Weekly Pelican was also a a source of information about just the daily life and things that went on in New Orleans. And you're exactly right. That was a commonplace occurrence. Um, and we need to start acknowledging this and realizing that people were not just cowed by the idea of slavery. They were fighting against it at all times, basically.
First
Um,
quietly, and then after the occupation in New Orleans, they came right out with it. I mean, especially the Rue days with the newspapers, they were just blatantly calling for the fair treatment of all people of color. And of course, you bring up before the petition. Um, can you go ahead and share that with people who are
Yeah, I mean, we talk about New Orleans and we think about hey, New Orleans was one of the most important ports in the United States. It was captured in 1862, and General Butler takes over and he starts enforcing rights for people of color, for free people of color. He realizes that he needs their cooperation, um, and so what does he do? What do the Rudinays do? And well, they immediately start a newspaper, a biweekly newspaper, French and English. And what do they start calling for? The emancipation of slaves, a full civil rights, participation in schools, participation in institutions, and they continue on that trail for a couple of years, receiving death threats on a daily basis. Um, and finally, I guess the death threats got so intense that they closed it down, but then started the Tribune. Um, that shortly after that. So we now that's what they did in 1862. In 1864, they had the Thousand Man Petition that was sent to Lincoln, really demanding um, suffrage. And the most prominent free men of color
right?
met. They met with a couple of emissaries from Lincoln to discuss this. And originally, they were going to just send a petition with people who could prove that they were free before um, the outbreak of the Civil War. But as
Right.
they went through the sort of genesis of this whole ideology behind this, they said no, they want universal suffrage. Um, and so they presented it to Lincoln. Lincoln did nothing with it. But Rudnay, J.B. Rudnay and Arnold Burtnow went and presented this to Lincoln, and then went around in Boston and around the North, really trying to gin up um, support for this petition. And I consider them having pushed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment forward to move the conversation forward. Never acknowledged. You'll never hear about that petition in school. I didn't learn about that petition until I was like
Maybe
15.
in maybe maybe these kind of conversations keep happening and people keep demanding, we're going to start learning. We're going to learn about our kids are going to continue to learn about or start learning about this rather. But yeah, I mean, just like you were saying, basically these people there were civil rights. They were fighting for civil rights. They were fighting for the freedoms of their fellow man. That's not to say that amongst them there were not some dogs who were
Oh yeah, yeah.
everything else.
In almost all the slave revolts that you have slaves that informed about the revolt, or told their white master. It's almost a universal thing. But what we need to recognize from New Orleans is that those early people in Creole society that were used to having some freedoms and used to exercising their rights a little bit more. They had a little more muscle on exercising their rights. When it came time to make the move to ask for suffrage, they were the first in line to do it.
Right.
When it came time to fighting at segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, that comes out of New Orleans. That doesn't come out of North Carolina or Baltimore or New York. It comes out of the deep South. And, when you start thinking about that, Plessy versus Ferguson, I mean, that is one of the pivotal moments in U.S. history, started by Creoles. Go ahead.
Like some history books shared, this was organized. This
Hmm.
wasn't something that just happened because I read this in history books before. They'll say, a man refused to do that. No, this was planned. They were planning this challenge. They were planning to do this.
Hmm.
So organized.
And then the whole community got together and funded the challenge. I mean, and you think about the organization and so here's there's this community. They're having soirees and parties and balls, and with the idea that they're having their good times, but in the end, they're going to be funding this thing that is going to change life for everybody in the United States. I mean, it goes to this. I mean, obviously, they didn't know it was going to go to the Supreme Court, but they were certainly saying, "Hey, I don't want to be discriminated against when I go on to mass transit or public transit." So you think about it in you have to think about New Orleans in the context of that, and how forward thinking these people were. For
They weren't just hanging out on their balconies, drinking and relishing life as free men of color. They wanted more, and they wanted more across the board for all people of color. Most of them, of course.
hmm yeah.
And I think that kind of transitions to our next point, which is, do Creoles have a look? do do Creoles have a look? You,
Give me your luck.
I mean, we know what a lot of people say Creoles look like. I think they have to have what is referred to as good hair,
Good
which
hair, yeah.
normally means uh, which normally means straight hair or more European as opposed to frizzy like this.
Hmm.
Uh, but uh, but the fact of
We're a mess, Jeremy. We're a
huh?
mess.
But that's what I mean. That's what the idea is because I've heard it before. People say, "Well, she doesn't look Creole,"
Uh,
and I'm like, "What do you mean?" And well, you know how they have the. I'm like, no, I don't. So, of course, this is a ridiculous notion. The Creoles of color have always looked all sorts of ways. Always since day one. Edwin Dede, uh,
yeah.
very
I'll show a picture of Edmund Day Day.
little picture, very little discernible European ancestry, if any.
Hmm.
Uh, then, of course, there was of course Henriette or Henriette Delille, who looked very European. And then there
Hmm.
were other people who looked more just kind of mixed. But the fact of the matter is this: there were white Creoles or Creoles of color, and they look all sorts of ways. And in many ways, they were connected not just through culture, but sometimes through family. And
Yeah,
there's no
I'm going to show the picture of me, you, and John LaFleur. Uh,
okay.
and John LaFleur, who's a white Creole and author and chef. And I mean, people need to let go of the idea that Creoles have a certain look.
Right.
I will say this: they're handsome people. Uh, but
Some,
the look is a variety. It's a variety that's that I think it's representative of Louisiana. It's representative of the people that came to Louisiana, um, and they have a variety of looks. I mean, we're mixed with Native American and German and Italian and French and Spanish. I mean, my relatives are Spanish. I mean, and so and Africans from Senegal, and Africans from Senegambia and Gambia. So of course uh, we're gonna have a variety, and we should,
right.
uh, but there is no look.
No,
Um,
there's a common now. In recent years, the word Creole has come to mean a person who's mixed or looking mixed. But the reality is, because there was fluid relationships in this colonial place. There was a lot of mixing, and so some Creoles look like that. But
mhm.
that is not the epitome of a Creole. That is not a archetype of Creole. That's not what a Creole has to look like. Creoles looked all sorts of ways. Some had red hair with blue eyes. Some had red hair with brown skin. Some of them had no hair. With this there, you don't get attached to the phenotypes of the idea of this. It's not necessarily true. So I think that's something that's kind of haunted this definition. And of course, with people of color, people have got with the idea of colorism and this and this. And in this society, there were moments where people just were more concerned about who you were culturally, and not so much what you look like. And of course, there were other periods where people did become hypersensitive to well, you gotta make sure not to marry this person or that. And just as the white Creoles began to distance themselves from people like us, some of the Creoles of color became very paranoid about looking too much like this or that. But that has nothing to actually do with the complete history of Creoles. We're just talking about certain
It,
chapters.
it really, a lot of it is economics. If you looked white, you may have had more economic opportunities than
Yeah,
your kinfolk who looked darker, and people made some very terrible decisions about how they were going to handle that, and a lot of them separated from their family members, moved away, so that they could take advantage of those opportunities, and that really happened a lot in my family. Um, and so, I went to a family reunion trying to kind of bridge that gap again because there were people literally that did not know they were of color there and had been raised up thinking that they were white. And when they saw who their first and second cousins were, I mean, let me tell you, it was a shot. It was a shot to them. There is really, like you say, there's no look. Like I say, I have my criterion, and let's go through the criterion again.
yeah. Tell them the criteria, which is
Yeah.
legit. I mean, it's
And this is legit. People can argue about it, and I love to hear their comments about it because
right.
I find it fascinating to hear what they've gleaned out of this. So, French or Spanish speaking, Catholic, raised in Creole tradition, a connection that you can connect yourself to pre-1803 Louisiana. That's a big
Colonial
deal.
roots.
Yeah.
Colonial roots, right?
Yeah, and so if you have those Catholic pre 1803, raised in Creole tradition, French, Spanish, any combination of races that were in Louisiana, Native American, white, black, any of those combinations, and you got all those in your background, you probably are a Creole.
Right. And I say just a descendant of the original colonial inhabitants of Louisiana. And if you notice, I didn't say settlers, I said inhabitants, because many of these people were kidnapped, stolen Africans, and brought here. Some of them were mixed with the indigenous people. So the inhabitants, not settlers. And I think that's about it. And I think that's pretty clear on what a Creole is. And to follow up, we can edit this out if you want, but uh, the story of passing people, Passe Blanc people who were of color, who crossed over this color line, most times in pursuit of better economic, opportunity. They went to places like California, Illinois. Some people only went to Texas and got away. I have no clue how that happened, but there was
Yeah.
actually people who passed for white in Texas. And of course, they also went other places such as Mexico and France and all these other places. But to follow up, it's a story with all Creoles of color. I honestly believe we all have missing cousins. I know for a fact some of my families we're missing some branches because these people just packed up in the middle of the night and we never heard from them again. And we know what was going on. This is 60, 70 years ago, but it's a sore subject and something that is hurtful. And for people of color, it goes into colorism and everything else. It's something that it's hurtful, and I think a lot of that has perpetuated negative feelings with identifying as Creole, because some people feel that challenges their ability to identify as either an African American, a person of African descent, or whatever. And it doesn't. You can be a white Creole, you could be a Creole of color, you can be whatever kind of Creole. We're inclusive and we're accepting people.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and that's exactly right. When we're inclusive and accepting, and Jeremy, I wrote an article about the black side of passing, kind of
yeah,
trying to sort out the some of the feelings that I noticed between my black and white relatives there at this family reunion that I went to, and it was posted on Afropunk, and I mean, wow, when you read the comments, I normally try not to read the comments because sometimes they're nonsense, but
yeah.
when you read the comments of people, and a lot of people commented on it, you will see how hurtful this phenotyping that we have is to people. Um, and I was just like I say, trying to um, sort out the feelings. And boy, I was surprised. I felt shocked a little bit by some of the younger people and the problems that they had with colorism and phenotypical traits that they had, and it was an eye opener. And like I say, I was sort of doing it for my family dynamics, but you
These
know,
things are all things that intensified after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, when society became more racist. A lot of people of color turned that inward on themselves and their family members. It is one of the unfortunate, nasty things that happen. But we live in a different day, a different time. It's a different day,
mhm.
so we're working past that, and hopefully, hopefully people can be proud to be Creole no matter what you look like, and we can continue to share this story, and it can inspire people of African descent, and it'll probably shock and amaze people of European descent as well.
Yeah. All right, Jeremy, let's leave it at that. We this is a good conversation. I appreciate
Yep.
you doing this. I We'll talk soon, and take care. We'll talk again. All right.
Okay.